Omaha Beach, Normandy. 0830 hours. June 6, 1944. A bulldozer, unarmed, just steel and an engine, lurched forward across the sand. No turret, no machine gun, not even a metal plate to hide behind. Just a man. And a job. Shells burst in the surf to its left, geysers of water and shrapnel climbing 30 feet into the air. Mortar rounds walked across the beach from the right, each impact closer than the last. From the bluff above, an MG-42 machine gun opened fire. 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like ripping canvas, tracers snapping past the bulldozer's cab. Pinned infantry behind the shingle barrier watched the dozer roll past them. One soldier, face pressed into the stones, muttered to the man beside him, "That poor bastard's already dead." Inside the cab, Private William J. Shoemaker sat with both hands on the controls. Dirt kicked up around the treads. A mortar round detonated 20 yards ahead, close enough to rattle the frame. He adjusted the throttle, checked the blade angle, felt the engine's response through the floor. He wasn't praying, wasn't thinking about home. He was thinking about traction, about keeping steady pressure on the hydraulics, about the exact same things he'd drilled 1,000 times in training. Except this time, the bullets were real. They called this a suicide mission. He treated 20,000 German bullets like a training exercise. Before the sun set that day, the exits off Omaha Beach would be open. Armor would roll inland. Infantry would push past the bluffs. And the entire invasion would hinge on what one man with a bulldozer did in the next 4 hours. But 6 hours earlier, when they first told him what the job was, everyone in the briefing room knew one thing for certain. Whoever drove that bulldozer wasn't coming back. Off the coast of Normandy. 0230 hours. In the transport ship's cramped hold, engineers from Company C, 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, gathered around a sand table. A lieutenant pointed to the narrow strips marked Exit E1 and Exit E3 on the model of Omaha Beach. Red pins dotted the high ground. Each one represented a German position, 88. Artillery, mortars, machine gun nests in concrete bunkers. All of them had pre-sighted firing lanes covering those exits. The lieutenant's voice was flat, factual. "The infantry's going to stack up behind the shingle if we can't clear routes off the beach. Vehicles will bottleneck at the waterline. Tanks can't climb that embankment without a ramp. We need those exits open in the first 2 hours, or the whole assault stalls." He looked at the engineers. "That means bulldozers, on the beach, under fire." One of the men, a sergeant from another company, shook his head slowly. "This is a suicide mission for whoever drives that bulldozer." No one disagreed. On paper, the math was brutal. A bulldozer moved at walking speed. It sat higher than a man. It was loud, visible, and couldn't hide behind cover. German gunners wouldn't need to aim carefully. They'd just pour fire into the general area and wait for the dozer to stop moving. Intelligence estimated that in the time it would take to clear one exit, the bulldozer would pass through a zone receiving tens of thousands of rounds, from machine guns, from mortars, from direct fire artillery. The phrase went around quietly, soldier to soldier. "Whoever's on that thing. One-way trip." In the back of the hold, Private William J. Shoemaker sat on an ammunition crate. 24 years old, from Ebensburg, Pennsylvania. Before the war, he'd worked construction, knew dirt, machines, and how to move heavy loads through bad ground. He wasn't sweating. His hands weren't shaking. He was running through the checklist in his head. Blade hydraulics. Engine when. throttle response under load, track tension, how to angle the blade when pushing through shingle, how to back out if the tread started to sink. Someone near him muttered, "You really gonna do it?" Shoemaker glanced up. His voice was calm. "It's just a job, same as we've been training for, just louder." The other man stared at him like he was insane. But Shoemaker wasn't being brave. He wasn't being reckless. He was being a professional. In his mind, this was a field problem. A difficult one. The kind where you couldn't afford mistakes. But the techniques were the same. The principles were the same. You followed your training, kept your head, and did the work. The fact that German gunners would be trying to kill him the entire time, that was just background noise. They called it a suicide mission. He would treat it like a training exercise. And in 4 hours, the question wouldn't be whether he survived. It would be whether Omaha Beach could hold without him. To understand why they called it a suicide mission, you need to understand Omaha Beach, not the beach you see in photographs after the battle. When the sand is clear, the fires are out, and the dead have been carried away. You need to see it the way it looked at 630 hours on June 6, 1944, the way it looked to the men coming off the landing craft. Omaha was supposed to be the linchpin of the invasion. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. American forces were tasked with taking Utah and Omaha, 2 stretches of sand along the Normandy coast that would serve as the entry point for men, armor, and supplies to push into occupied France. But Omaha was different. Omaha was a killing ground by design. The beach itself was a crescent, roughly 6 miles long, backed by bluffs rising up to 150 feet. At the base of those bluffs ran a sea wall. In some places concrete, in others just a steep embankment of shingle and stone. Between the waterline and that wall, 300 yards of open sand. No cover, no concealment, just flat, empty beach. And the Germans had spent years turning it into a fortress. Pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery, 88mm guns, 75mm anti-tank guns, mortars, machine gun nests every 50 yards, most of them dug into concrete bunkers that could withstand naval bombardment minefields, barbed wire, steel obstacles in the surf designed to rip the hulls out of landing craft. Every inch of that beach had been measured, ranged, pre-sighted. The Germans didn't need to aim. They just needed to fire into grid squares and wait for Americans to die. The assault plan had counted on overwhelming firepower to soften those defenses. Naval guns, bombers, rockets. But the naval bombardment had been too short. The bombers, flying through cloud cover, had dropped their payloads inland, missing the beach defenses entirely, which meant when the first wave of infantry hit the sand at 6:30, they walked into defenses that were fully intact, fully manned, and fully ready. The result was chaos. Landing craft were hit before they reached the beach. Men drowned in the surf, weighed down by equipment. Tanks, the amphibious DD Shermans that were supposed to provide cover, sank in the rough seas. Most never made it to shore. The infantry that survived the water found themselves pinned down within minutes, trapped between the tide and the shingle, with nowhere to go. Officers were killed in the first minutes. Radios were lost. Command broke down. And the vehicles, The trucks, the jeeps, the half-tracks, the artillery pieces sat burning in the surf or stalled in the sand, unable to move forward, because there was no road off the beach. That was the job of the engineers. The 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, the 299th, the 5th Engineer Special Brigade. Their mission: clear paths through the obstacles, blow gaps in the wire, mark lanes through the minefields, and, critically, open the exits. There were 5 designated exits off Omaha Beach, narrow draws, dirt roads that led up through the bluffs and into the countryside beyond. Exit E1, Exit E3, D1, D3, F1. If those exits stayed closed, the entire invasion would pile up on the beach. Vehicles couldn't climb the bluffs without a road. Infantry couldn't advance without support. Armor couldn't push inland. The exits had to be opened, and that meant bulldozers. The bulldozers were standard civilian models, Caterpillar D7s, the kind you'd see on any construction site back home. They'd been modified slightly for combat: reinforced blades, waterproofed engines, tow hooks welded to the chassis. But they had no armor, no weapons, no protection for the driver. They were slow, loud, highly visible, and their job required them to work in the open, in full view of every German gun on the high ground, for hours at a time. In the planning phase, engineers had estimated that a bulldozer working the beach would be exposed to sustained fire from artillery, direct fire from 88mm guns zeroed in on the exits, mortars, dropping shells with precision onto the roadways, machine guns, MG-42s with overlapping fields of fire, each capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The math was brutal. In the time it took to clear one exit, push through the shingle, fill an anti-tank ditch, remove a roadblock, a bulldozer would pass through a zone receiving tens of thousands of rounds. There was no way to armor a dozer against that volume of fire. No way to hide it. No way to make it move faster. The only variable was the man driving it, and whether he could keep working while the entire German defense tried to kill him. Most of the bulldozers never got the chance. Of the 16 dozers assigned to Omaha Beach, only a handful made it off the landing craft intact. The rest were hit by artillery, bogged down in the surf, or abandoned when their drivers were killed. By 0800 hours, the beach was a junkyard. Burning vehicles, wounded men, equipment scattered across the sand, and the exits, all 5 of them, still closed. Infantry units, pinned behind the shingle, couldn't move forward. Armor couldn't get off the beach. Supplies couldn't be unloaded. The entire assault was stalling. And that's when Private William J. Shoemaker, sitting in the cab of one of the last working bulldozers on Omaha Beach, made a decision. He was going to open exit E1, and then exit E3, no matter how long it took, no matter how much fire came down. He had a job to do. William J. Shoemaker wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a private, 24 years old, from Ebensburg, Pennsylvania, a small town in the Allegheny Mountains where most men worked coal mines or lumber mills. Before the war, Shoemaker had worked construction, heavy equipment operator, bulldozers, graders, earth movers. He knew dirt, knew machines, knew how to move tons of material through bad ground without getting stuck, without breaking the equipment, without wasting time. It wasn't glamorous work. It was skilled labor, the kind of job where you showed up, did what needed to be done, and went home. That's how he thought about combat engineering, too. When he enlisted and was assigned to Company C, 37th Engineer Combat Battalion, he didn't see himself as a soldier in the traditional sense. He saw himself as a tradesman who happened to be wearing a uniform. His job wasn't to shoot Germans. It was to move obstacles, clear roads, keep the machinery running. And that mindset, that blue-collar, no-nonsense, get-the-job-done mentality, was about to save lives on the most dangerous beach in the world. The training had been relentless, months of it, operating dozers in rain, in mud, at night, under simulated fire, learning how to read terrain, how to judge load capacity, how to maneuver a 10-ton machine through tight spaces without flipping it. They drilled the basics over and over until it became muscle memory. Throttle control, blade angle, weight distribution, how to back out of soft ground without bogging the treads, how to push through obstacles without stalling the engine. And they drilled one other thing: focus. When you're on a bulldozer, you can't afford distractions. You can't let your mind wander. The machine weighs 5 tons. The blade can crush a man. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the job goes wrong. So you learn to compartmentalize. You focus on the levers, the gauges, the sound of the engine. You tune out everything else. The noise, the chaos, the fear. You just do the work. That's what made Shoemaker different. It wasn't that he was braver than the other men. It wasn't that he didn't feel fear. It was that he had a switch in his head. When he sat down in that cab, when his hands touched the controls, when the engine turned over, everything else disappeared. The briefing room conversation about suicide missions, gone. The knowledge that German gunners were targeting him specifically, background noise. The explosions, the bullets, the screaming, all of it faded into the periphery. What mattered was the job. Blade down, throttle steady, watch the ground, feel the engine, execute the task, one step at a time. On the transport ship, hours before the landing, one of the other engineers had asked him, "You scared?" Shoemaker had thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," he'd said, "but it doesn't matter. Scared doesn't change the job." The other man had stared at him. "How do you do that? Just turn it off?" Shoemaker shrugged. "Same way I do it on a job site. You've got a task. You know how to do the task. So you do it. Doesn't matter if it's raining, or if the foreman's yelling, or if you're tired. The dirt still needs moving. The road still needs clearing." He paused. "This is just a harder job. That's all." The other man had shaken his head, unconvinced. But Shoemaker wasn't trying to be philosophical. He wasn't trying to sound tough. He was just describing how his brain worked. To him, D-Day wasn't an epic historical moment. It wasn't a test of courage or a chance for glory. It was a field problem. A very dangerous field problem, with live ammunition and consequences. But the principles were the same. Later, after the war, someone would ask him how he did it, how he drove a bulldozer across Omaha Beach under sustained fire for 4 hours without braking. His answer was simple. "I just pretended I was back at training. You do the drills enough times, your hands know what to do. You don't think about it. You just work." That mindset, that ability to treat 20,000 German bullets like a training exercise, wasn't bravado. It was professionalism. The kind that comes from knowing your craft so well that even when the world is exploding around you, your hands stay steady on the controls. At 08:30 hours, When Shoemaker's bulldozer rolled off the landing craft and onto Omaha Beach, he wasn't thinking about history. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He was thinking, throttle steady, blade at 30 degrees, watch for soft sand near the waterline. Don't let the treads spin. The Germans opened fire. Shoemaker adjusted the throttle and kept driving, because that's what the job required. And he'd trained for this. 630 hours. The ramp dropped. Sound hit first. Not gunfire, just noise. A wall of it, explosions layered on top of explosions. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, all blending into one continuous roar that made the metal deck vibrate under Shoemaker's boots. Then the smell, diesel fuel, seawater, smoke, and something else, sharp, metallic, cordite, maybe, or blood. The landing craft's engine rumbled beneath him. Around him, engineers checked their gear one last time. Some were pale, some muttering prayers. One man vomited into his helmet. Shoemaker sat in the cab of the bulldozer, hands on the controls. The dozer was lashed to the deck with chains, yellow paint already streaked with salt spray, engine idling, blade locked in transport position. He ran through the checklist one more time in his head. Throttle response, good. Hydraulics, pressure holding. Treads, tension correct. Blade, locked, but ready to drop on command. Outside, through the gap at the top of the ramp, he could see flashes. Orange bursts against the gray dawn sky. Naval shells arcing overhead toward the bluffs. And from the bluffs, return fire, streaks of light falling toward the beach. Somewhere ahead, men were dying. The officer in charge, a lieutenant, soaked to the skin, face gray with fatigue, shouted over the engine noise, 30 seconds! Engineers first, then the dozer! Shoemaker nodded, released the parking brake. His hands stayed steady on the controls. Beside the landing craft, a shell hit the water. The explosion lifted a column of spray 30 feet into the air. The boat rocked. Someone cursed. The lieutenant looked back at Shoemaker. For a moment, their eyes met. The lieutenant didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The look said it all. Good luck. You're going to need it. Then the ramp dropped. Cold seawater poured in. The engineers bolted down the ramp, splashing into chest-deep surf, and immediately scattered, some toward the beach, some crouching behind the ramp itself, trying to get their bearings. Shoemaker released the chains, put the dozer in gear. The engine roared, a deep, guttural sound that cut through even the gunfire. The bulldozer rolled forward, down the ramp, into the water. The cold was immediate and shocking. Seawater surged up over the treads, over the blade, splashing into the open cab. Shoemaker felt it soak through his boots, his trousers, but he kept his hands steady. Throttle forward, blade up to reduce drag. Keep the engine above water. For a few seconds, the dozer seemed to sink. 5 tons of steel settling into the soft sand beneath the surf. The treads spun, searching for traction. Then they caught. The engine pulled. The machine lurched forward, plowing through the waves. Behind him, the landing craft was already reversing, pulling away. The ramp closed. The boat turned, heading back out to sea for another load. Shoemaker was alone. The first thing he saw was the smoke, thick, gray, drifting across the water in layers. Through it, shapes, dark, indistinct, some moving, some not. He steered toward the beach, following the path the engineers had taken. The water was shallower now, waist deep, then knee deep. The dozer climbed onto wet sand, And then the smoke cleared, and Shoemaker saw Omaha Beach. Nothing in the briefings had prepared him for this. The beach was supposed to be secured by now. The first wave was supposed to have pushed inland. Tanks were supposed to be advancing. Engineers were supposed to be marking lanes, clearing obstacles in an organized sequence. Instead, what he saw was chaos. Burning vehicles. Everywhere. Tanks. Some on their sides, some with turrets blown off, some just sitting in the surf, hatches open, no crew visible. Half-tracks engulfed in flames, black smoke pouring into the sky. Jeeps overturned. Landing craft stuck on obstacles, waves pounding them, ramps hanging open. Wreckage blocked every lane. Disabled trucks, trailers, equipment scattered across the sand like a junkyard. And bodies, dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Lying in the surf, half buried in the sand, floating face down in the tide. The living were worse. Men crouched behind anything they could find. Wrecked vehicles, steel obstacles, piles of shingle. Some were trying to move forward, crawling on their bellies. Most were just pinned, heads down, pressed flat against the sand, not moving. No one was advancing. The entire assault had ground to a halt, and above it all from the bluffs, constant fire. Muzzle flashes by the dozens, machine guns, mortars, artillery, all of it directed down onto the beach, onto the men trapped there, onto anything that moved. Shoemaker had seen battlefields in training exercises. He'd seen obstacle courses designed to simulate combat conditions. This was different. This was industrial-scale killing. The dozer rolled forward onto dry sand, and immediately the volume of fire changed. Before, the German gunners had been firing into the general mass of infantry. Suppressive fire. Area denial. Now they had a target. A bulldozer. Bright yellow. Moving slowly. Impossible to miss. From the German observation posts on the bluffs, radios crackled. Officers shouted coordinates. Mortar teams adjusted their aim. Machine gunners swiveled their weapons, tracking the movement of the dozer. They understood what it meant. If the bulldozer survived, it would clear the wrecks, open the lanes, let the American vehicles move inland. If it died, the beach stayed blocked. So they concentrated fire. The first mortar round landed 40 yards ahead of the dozer. A fountain of sand and smoke. Shoemaker didn't flinch. He kept the throttle steady, eyes on the terrain ahead. Wet sand firm enough for traction. Good. Debris scattered everywhere. He'd need to pick a path. The second mortar round landed 30 yards to his left. Closer. They were bracketing him. Walking the rounds in. Standard artillery procedure. Get the range, then adjust. A machine gun opened up from the bluff. The sound was distinct, faster than American guns, sharper. An MG-42. 1,200 rounds per minute. Tracers arced down toward the beach. Most went wide. A few hit the sand near the dozer's treads, kicking up little geysers of dirt. Shoemaker adjusted his grip on the controls. In training, they'd told him, if you take fire, keep moving. A stationary target is a dead target. But his job wasn't to keep moving. His job was to clear obstacles, which meant stopping, positioning the dozer, working, which meant becoming a stationary target. He looked ahead at the waterline, at the wrecked tanks, the disabled trucks, the landing craft stuck on obstacles. The entire lane, from the surf to the shingle, was blocked. Behind those wrecks, vehicles were piling up, unable to move forward, sitting targets for German gunners. If he didn't clear it, they'd stay trapped. Another mortar round, 20 yards out now. The Germans had the range. Shoemaker took a breath. Then he turned the dozer toward the first wreck, a Sherman tank canted on its side in the surf, and drove forward. Into the kill zone. The Sherman tank sat half submerged in the surf, canted at a 45-degree angle. Turret blown off, hull blackened. Waves crashed against it, surging through the open hatches, then pulling back in a wash of foam and oil. It sat directly in the path every vehicle needed to take to get off the beach. Behind it, a line of trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps idled in the water. Engines running, drivers waiting, unable to move forward. Shoemaker maneuvered the dozer toward the tank. Blade down. Approach angle shallow to avoid getting stuck in the soft sand beneath the surf. A mortar round landed 15 yards to his right, close enough that he felt the concussion through the seat. Debris rained down, sand, water, shrapnel. Something metallic pinged off the dozer's frame. He kept driving. The infantryman pinned behind the shingle watched him. One soldier, face pressed into the stones, helmet half buried in sand, lifted his head just enough to see the bulldozer roll past. He muttered to the man beside him, "That guy's dead. He just doesn't know it yet." The other soldier didn't answer. He was staring at the dozer, watching it move toward the wreck with the kind of slow, deliberate pace you'd see on a construction site. No zigzagging, no evasive maneuvers. Just straight towards the target, like the bullets weren't even there. Shoemaker brought the dozer to a stop beside the tank. Cut the throttle back to idle. The engine settled into a low rumble. For a moment, maybe 5 seconds, everything was relatively quiet. Just the sound of waves, the distant crackle of gunfire up the beach. Then the Germans realized he'd stopped. An MG-42 opened up. Long, sustained burst. The sound like tearing fabric. Tracers snapped across the water, stitching a line toward the dozer. Most of the rounds went wide. A few hit the blade, sparking, ricocheting off into the sand. One punched through the thin metal skin of the cab just above Shoemaker's head and exited out the other side. He didn't look up. He was already out of the seat, moving around to the back of the dozer, pulling a tow chain from the storage rack. Heavy steel links, 30 feet long. He dragged it through the surf toward the tank. Bullets hit the water around him. Little geysers. Crack, crack, crack. He hooked the chain to the tank's tow point, tested the connection. Solid. Then he waded back to the dozer, climbed into the cab, and engaged the winch. The chain went taut. The dozer's engine roared. The treads bit into the wet sand, throwing up spray. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank was too heavy, too deep in the sand. Stuck. Shoemaker adjusted the blade angle, lowered it, using it as a counterweight to keep the dozer from being pulled backward. Throttle up. More power. The treads dug in deeper. The engine screamed. And slowly, inch by inch, the tank began to move. It scraped, groaned, metal shrieking against sand and stone. The hull shifted, rolled slightly, and then, with a sudden lurch, broke free of the sand. Shoemaker kept pulling. The dozer backed up, dragging the tank sideways. Out of the lane until it was clear of the path. Done. He released the winch, dropped the chain into the surf. Behind him, the first truck in line, engine already running, rolled forward through the gap. The driver gave a quick nod as he passed, heading toward the shingle. Shoemaker didn't acknowledge it. He was already looking for the next obstacle. A jeep, flipped upside down, wheels in the air, sitting right where the next wave of vehicles would need to pass. Shoemaker drove the dozer up to it, blade down. No finesse, just brute force. He hit the jeep at a walking pace. The blade caught it, lifted it, and shoved. The jeep tumbled, scraped, rolled across the sand until it was out of the traffic lane. Another mortar round. This one closer, 10 yards. The explosion was loud enough to make his ears ring. Dirt and shrapnel hammered the side of the dozer. Something hot stung his forearm, a piece of metal maybe, or stone. He glanced down. Blood. Not much. Ignored it. Next obstacle, a half-track. Nose down in the sand. Engine dead, blocking the way. Shoemaker positioned the dozer, blade against the rear of the half-track. Throttle up. Push. The half-track resisted. Dug in. Shoemaker adjusted the blade angle, got under the frame, and lifted. The front end of the half-track came up out of the sand. He pushed again. It slid, moved, cleared the lane. Done. From the German observation posts on the bluffs, officers were shouting into radios. "Bulldozer! Grid square 4-7. Concentrate fire." Mortar teams adjusted. Artillery crews recalculated. Machine gunners poured fire into the area where the dozer was working. They understood the math. One bulldozer was clearing the beach, opening lanes, enabling the American advance. Kill it, and the assault stalls. So they threw everything at it. For the next 30 minutes, the dozer became the single most targeted piece of equipment on Omaha Beach. Mortar rounds walked across the sand, following Shoemaker's path. Explosions bracketed him, ahead, behind, left, right, some so close that the concussion lifted the front of the dozer off the ground. Artillery shells cratered the beach. One landed close enough that the shockwave blew out the dozer's windshield. Glass shattered. Shoemaker kept driving, squinting through the glare and smoke. Machine gun fire never stopped. Constant. Relentless. Bullets hammered the blade. Dozens, maybe hundreds of impacts. Some ricocheted. Some punched through and embedded in the hydraulic housing. One severed a hydraulic line. Fluid sprayed. The blade started to sag. Shoemaker compensated. Adjusted the angle manually. Kept working. Another wreck. A truck, axle broken, sitting in the shingle. He pushed it aside. Another. A landing craft, stuck on an obstacle. He couldn't move it, too heavy. So he pushed sand and debris around it, creating a bypass lane. Another. A pile of equipment, crates, barrels, ammunition boxes, blown off a vehicle and scattered across the path. He bulldozed it into a heap, shoved it off to the side. One obstacle at a time. One vehicle at a time. Methodically. Professionally. While German gunners poured fire into his position. To the infantry watching from behind the shingle, it didn't make sense. The dozer should have been destroyed 10 times over. The driver should have been dead. But the machine kept moving, and the man inside kept working. Not fast, not reckless, just steady. Like he was clearing a road back home. Like the explosions were just weather. Like the bullets were background noise. One soldier, crouched behind a wrecked half-track, watched the dozer roll past for the 3rd time. He turned to his sergeant. "How is he still alive?" The sergeant shook his head. "I don't know, but if he stops, we're stuck here." Inside the cab, Shoemaker's world had narrowed to a very simple loop. Identify obstacle. Approach. Position the blade. Engage. Clear. Move to the next. His hands stayed steady on the controls. His breathing stayed even. He wasn't thinking about the bullets, wasn't counting the explosions, wasn't calculating his odds. He was just doing the job. Throttle control, blade angle, traction, weight distribution. The same things he'd drilled 1,000 times, the same muscle memory. The only difference was the noise, and the noise didn't matter. Because the dirt still needed moving. The road still needed clearing, and he knew how to do that. By 0900 hours, Shoemaker had cleared a lane from the waterline to the base of the shingle. Vehicles were moving. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, rolling off the beach, one after another, using the path he'd opened. Infantry followed. Using the cleared lane to advance, no longer pinned at the water's edge. The German gunners kept firing, kept trying to destroy the bulldozer, but Shoemaker was already moving toward the next task, the shingle barrier, and exit E1. The shingle barrier ran the length of Omaha Beach like a wall. Not a clean wall, not brick or concrete, just a massive ridge of smooth stones, some the size of fists, some the size of footballs, piled 15 feet high by centuries of tide and storm. Behind it, infantry huddled, pinned, unable to advance. In front of it, vehicles sat stalled. Jeeps, half-tracks, even a few tanks, engines running, but going nowhere. The stones were too loose, too steep. Wheels spun. Treads slipped. Nothing could climb it. And beyond the shingle, up the bluff, the Germans kept firing. The only way off the beach was through one of the 5 designated exits, narrow gaps in the terrain where dirt roads led up through the bluffs toward the interior. Exit E1 was 200 yards to Shoemaker's left. Exit E3 was 300 yards to his right. Both were supposed to have been opened by now. Both were still blocked. Shoemaker turned the dozer toward E1. The problem with shingle was simple. It moved. You couldn't just drive over it. The stones shifted under weight. Vehicles sank. Treads lost traction. Wheels dug in and spun uselessly. What you needed was a ramp. A solid path. Packed earth or gravel, wide enough for vehicles. Angled shallow enough that trucks and half-tracks could climb without bogging down. Building one required a bulldozer. And time. And the willingness to work in full view of every German gun on the high ground. Shoemaker drove the dozer up to the base of the shingle barrier, lowered the blade, angled it 30 degrees. Then he pushed forward. The blade bit into the stones. The dozer's engine roared. Rocks tumbled, shifted, piled up against the blade. Shoemaker backed up, repositioned, pushed again. Slowly, a cut began to form in the barrier. A narrow trench sloping upward. The Germans saw it immediately. From the bluffs, an artillery observer radioed coordinates. Bulldozer, working the shingle. Exit E1. Range 400 meters. 30 seconds later, the first shell landed. It hit 20 yards behind the dozer. The explosion was enormous, a fountain of dirt and stones that climbed 50 feet into the air. The shockwave hit Shoemaker's back like a physical blow. Debris rained down, clattering off the dozer's frame. He kept pushing. Another shell. 15 yards to the left, another, 10 yards to the right. They were bracketing him again. Walking the fire in. Shoemaker made another pass. The blade pushed through the shingle, carving deeper into the barrier. Stones cascaded down the slope behind him. The trench was taking shape, 6 feet wide now, angled at maybe 20 degrees. Not done yet. He reversed, lined up for another pass. A mortar round hit 5 yards in front of the dozer. The explosion blew stones into the air like shrapnel. Something hit Shoemaker's shoulder, hard enough to knock him sideways in the seat. He steadied himself, checked his arm. Bruised. Maybe cracked. Didn't matter. He pushed forward again. From the infantry's perspective, it looked like a slow-motion execution. The bulldozer sat in the open, fully exposed, working the same 20-yard stretch of shingle over and over. Every pass took 30 seconds. Every pass, the German gunners adjusted their fire. Got closer. A sergeant crouched behind the barrier, watching. He turned to his radio man. "That driver's either the bravest son of a bitch I've ever seen, or he's out of his mind." The radio man didn't answer. He was watching the dozer make another pass, stones tumbling off the blade, while shells landed close enough to throw dirt over the cab. "Both, maybe," the radio man finally said. Inside the cab, Shoemaker's focus was absolute. Blade angle, throttle, traction. He could feel the dozer struggling against the loose stones. The treads wanted to slip. He compensated. More weight on the blade, less throttle, let the machine's mass do the work instead of the engine. Another shell. Closer. The concussion rattled his teeth. He ignored it. Another pass. The trench was deeper now, 8 feet wide, stones packed down at the bottom from repeated compression. He backed up, repositioned. An MG-42 opened fire. Long burst. Bullets hammered the blade, the treads, the exposed engine housing. One round punched through the thin metal of the cab and buried itself in the seat cushion, 6 inches from Shoemaker's leg. He made another pass. By 09:45 hours, the cut through the shingle at exit E1 was finished. A ramp, 12 feet wide, packed solid, angled shallow enough for vehicles. Shoemaker reversed the dozer, pulled clear, and waved forward the first vehicle in line, a jeep loaded with ammunition. The jeep's driver hesitated, looked at the ramp, looked at the German guns on the bluff. Shoemaker waved again, more urgently. The jeep rolled forward, hit the ramp, climbed. The wheels found traction. The jeep surged up the slope, over the crest of the shingle, and disappeared inland. Behind it, a truck, then another jeep, then a half-track. One by one, vehicles that had been trapped on the beach began moving inland. Exit E1 was open. Shoemaker sat in the cab for a moment, engine idling, hand still on the controls. He watched the vehicles roll past, watched the infantry follow. Men who'd been pinned behind the shingle for 3 hours, finally able to move forward. Some of them looked at the dozer as they passed. A few nodded. One young soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, stopped, turned, and gave a quick salute before running to catch up with his unit. Shoemaker didn't salute back. He wasn't sure what to do with gestures like that. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not much, just a slight tremor. Adrenaline, probably. Or exhaustion. He flexed his fingers, gripped the controls tighter until the shaking stopped. Behind him, the beach was still chaos. Smoke rising from burning vehicles, medics working on the wounded. Bodies covered with ponchos, lined up along the shingle. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Engineers. Infantry, tankers, men who'd made it off the landing craft only to die in the first 100 yards. Shoemaker recognized one of the ponchos, the boots underneath. Standard issue, but with a piece of tape wrapped around the left heel, a field repair. He'd seen those boots that morning, on the transport ship. Another engineer from Company C, a guy from Ohio. They'd never spoken much, just nodded to each other in passing. Now he was under a poncho, and Shoemaker was still here. Still breathing. Still working. There was no logic to it. No reason. Just luck. Or the absence of it, depending on which side of the poncho you were on. He took a breath. Let it out slowly. Then he shifted the dozer into gear and turned toward exit E3. Because the job wasn't finished. Because men were still trapped. Because the exits had to stay open or everything, all of it, the dying, the drowning, the burning, would be for nothing. He drove. 300 yards down the beach, under fire the entire way. Shells followed him. Mortar rounds walked alongside. Machine gun tracers snapped past the cab. He kept driving. Exit E3 was worse than E1. The shingle here was thicker, steeper. And beyond it, the Germans had positioned a concrete pillbox with a clear line of sight down the exit road. Shoemaker brought the dozer up to the barrier and started working. The process was the same. Push, reverse, reposition, push again. Slowly, the ramp took shape. But this time, the fire was heavier. The pillbox had a direct view of the dozer. Machine guns poured fire into the area. Sustained bursts. Hundreds of rounds. The blade took most of the hits. Metal sparking, rounds ricocheting in every direction. But some got through. One round shattered the remaining glass in the cab. Another tore through the engine cowling. Smoke began pouring from the hydraulic system. The line Shoemaker had jury-rigged earlier was failing. The blade started to drop, losing pressure. Shoemaker reached down, twisted a valve, rerouted the hydraulic flow through a backup line. The blade stabilized. Not perfect, but good enough. He kept working. Another shell. This one so close that the dozer actually lifted, front end coming off the ground, treads spinning in the air for a moment before crashing back down. Shoemaker's head hit the roll bar. Stars. His vision blurred. He shook it off. Blinked. Focused. Throttle. Blade. Traction. Another pass. The ramp was almost done. Just needed one more push to pack the top layer. He lined up. Engaged. The blade bit into the shingle. Stones tumbled. The slope compressed. Done. Shoemaker pulled the dozer clear and signaled the vehicles waiting behind him. A half-track rolled forward, climbed the ramp, made it over. Then a truck. Then another. Exit E3 was open. By 1,000 hours, both exits were clear. Vehicles were flowing off Omaha Beach. Armor, artillery, supply trucks, all moving inland, using the paths Shoemaker had carved through the shingle. Infantry followed. No longer pinned. No longer trapped. The German defenders, watching from the bluffs, saw their advantage slipping away. Without the bottleneck at the exits, the Americans could bring their full weight to bear. Tanks could advance. Artillery could set up. Infantry could maneuver. The defense was beginning to crack. And it all hinged on 2 ramps through a barrier of stones, built by one man, with a bulldozer, while 20,000 German bullets tried to stop him. Shoemaker idled the dozer near exit E3, watched the flow of vehicles, trucks, jeeps, ambulances now, heading back down to evacuate the wounded. The math was simple. Brutal, but simple. 2 exits open meant hundreds of men could move inland, could get off the killing ground, could fight from positions that weren't just holes in the sand. 2 exits closed would have meant those same men stayed pinned, stayed dying. Until the tide came in or the Germans pushed them back into the sea, He'd opened the exits, but he hadn't stopped the dying. Men were still falling on the bluffs, still getting hit by mortar fire inland, still bleeding out in the surf while medics tried to reach them. All he'd done was move the death forward, 50 yards, 100 yards, enough to give the living a chance. That was the job. Not to stop the war, not to save everyone, just to clear the road, so the ones who were still breathing could keep moving. Shoemaker looked at the dozer's gauges. Fuel low, hydraulics barely holding, engine temperature climbing into the red. And ahead, blocking the exit road itself, he could see 2 roadblocks, makeshift barriers of logs, wire, and debris. And beyond that, an anti-tank ditch. Both had to be cleared, or the exits would close again, or armor couldn't get through, or the entire advance would stall just past the shingle. He shifted into gear. The engine coughed, caught, roared. Shoemaker drove toward the first roadblock. The first roadblock sat 50 yards past the shingle, right where the exit road began to climb toward the bluffs. Logs, steel rails, barbed wire, debris from destroyed vehicles, all of it piled together in a deliberate tangle, chest high, blocking the entire width of the road. Behind it, German engineers had dug firing positions, machine gun nests, mortar pits. The roadblock wasn't just an obstacle. It was bait, a killing zone designed to trap anyone who tried to clear it. Shoemaker drove the dozer toward it. The German gunners saw him coming. From the pillbox above exit E3, an MG-42 opened fire. Long, sustained burst. Tracers arced down, snapping past the dozer's cab, hammering into the blade. Shoemaker didn't slow down. He lined up the approach angle. Blade down. Full throttle. The dozer hit the roadblock with a shriek of metal on metal. The blade caught the logs, lifted them, shoved them forward. Wire tangled around the blade. Steel rails scraped across the ground, throwing sparks. The dozer pushed. The roadblock resisted. Then, with a groaning, splintering crash, it gave way. Logs tumbled. Wire snapped. The debris pile collapsed sideways, half of it pushed off the road, half of it crushed under the dozer's treads. Shoemaker backed up, repositioned, hit it again. This time, the roadblock broke apart completely. Logs scattered, rails bent. Wire dragged clear. The road was open. A mortar round landed 10 feet to the left. The explosion threw dirt and shrapnel across the dozer. Something hot sliced across Shoemaker's forearm, a piece of metal, razor thin. Blood welled up immediately, soaking into his sleeve. He glanced at it. Not deep. Kept working. He pushed the last of the debris off the road, backed the dozer clear, waved forward the vehicles waiting at the base of the exit. A Sherman tank rolled past, turret traversing, scanning for targets on the bluffs. The tank commander, standing in the hatch, looked down at Shoemaker and gave a quick thumbs up. Shoemaker nodded, turned the dozer toward exit E1. The second roadblock was waiting. By the time he reached E1, the German fire had intensified. They understood now. The bulldozer wasn't just clearing wreckage, it was systematically dismantling their defense. Every obstacle removed, every exit opened, weakened their position. If they couldn't stop the dozer, they couldn't stop the advance. So they concentrated everything on it. Artillery shells walked up the road, following the dozer's path. Mortar rounds dropped in clusters. Machine guns from multiple positions poured fire into the area. Crossfire, overlapping fields, no safe angle. Shoemaker drove into it. The roadblock at E1 was heavier than the first. Concrete barriers, overturned vehicles, a burned-out half-track wedged sideways across the road. He hit it with the blade. The impact jarred his spine. The dozer's engine screamed. The blade bent, metal groaning under the load, but held. He pushed. Inch by inch, the roadblock moved. A shell landed close. The shockwave knocked Shoemaker forward against the controls. His forehead hit the steering column. Blood ran into his eyes. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. Kept pushing. The half-track shifted. Rolled. Scraped across the pavement with a sound like a train derailing. Shoemaker reversed. Hit it again. The roadblock broke. He cleared the debris. Opened the lane. Done. He sat in the cab, engine idling, and looked at his hands. They were covered in blood. Some of it his. Some of it from the steering column, where someone else's blood had dried days ago, maybe during transport. Or maybe it was just rust mixed with hydraulic fluid and dirt. He couldn't tell anymore. His ears were ringing, had been for hours. Everything sounded distant, muffled, like he was underwater. He could see explosions, see muzzle flashes, but the sound came delayed, distorted. He flexed his fingers. They responded. Still worked. That was all that mattered. Through the smoke, he could see infantry advancing up the road he'd just cleared. Squads moving in formation, using the ditches for cover, pushing toward the German positions on the high ground. They were moving because he'd opened the road. But some of them wouldn't make it to the top. Some would get hit by machine gun fire, or mortars, or artillery before they reached the crest. And there was nothing he could do about that. His job was the road, not the men on it. He'd learned that in training. You can't control everything. You can't save everyone. You do your part. You do it right. And you let the next man do his. But knowing that didn't make it easier to watch. He took a breath. Let it out. Then he shifted into gear. Because there was still one more obstacle. The anti-tank ditch. And if he didn't fill it, the armor couldn't get through. And if the armor couldn't get through, the infantry on the high ground would be unsupported. Exposed. Vulnerable. So he drove. The anti-tank ditch ran perpendicular to exit E3, just past the second shingle barrier. 10 feet wide, 8 feet deep. Steep walls, designed to stop tanks cold. Right now, it was doing exactly that. A Sherman sat at the edge of the ditch, engine running, unable to cross. Behind it, 3 more tanks waited in line, and behind them, artillery pieces, supply trucks, ambulances. All stalled. Shoemaker brought the dozer up to the edge of the ditch and looked down. The bottom was soft. Muddy. If he drove in, the dozer might bog down. Might not be able to climb out. He'd have to fill it. He reversed the dozer, positioned it beside a pile of loose dirt and rubble, remnants of the shingle barrier. Lowered the blade. Pushed. The blade bit into the dirt. The dozer shoved forward. Dirt and stones tumbled into the ditch. He backed up, made another pass. More dirt, more stones. Slowly, the ditch began to fill. The Germans saw what he was doing. From the bluffs, observers radioed new coordinates. Bulldozer, anti-tank ditch. Exit E3. Concentrate all fire. Artillery shells began landing in a pattern, bracketing the ditch, walking toward the dozer. One landed 20 yards out, then 15, then 10. Shoemaker kept pushing dirt, another pass. The ditch was half filled now. Not enough. Tanks needed a solid ramp. Needed packed earth, not loose rubble. He made another pass. A mortar round hit 5 yards away. The explosion lifted the rear of the dozer off the ground. The treads spun in the air for a moment before crashing back down. Something in the transmission crunched. The dozer lurched, stalled. Shoemaker twisted the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, died. He tried again. Nothing. For a moment, everything went quiet. Just the distant sound of gunfire. The wind across the bluffs. The waves on the beach below. Shoemaker sat in the cab. Looked at the gauges. Fuel pressure. 0. Engine temperature. Red line. Hydraulic pressure. Failing. The dozer was dying. He'd pushed it too hard. Too long. 5 hours of sustained operation under fire. The engine had finally given up. Behind him, the line of tanks sat waiting. Crews watching, wondering if the road would open, or if they'd sit here, exposed, until German artillery found them. Shoemaker climbed out of the cab. His legs almost gave out when his boots hit the ground. He steadied himself against the dozer's frame. Exhaustion hit him all at once, the adrenaline draining away, leaving just the weight of 5 hours of sustained terror that he'd been ignoring. His hands were shaking again. Worse this time. He leaned against the dozer, took a breath. Around him, the battlefield continued. Shells falling, machine guns chattering, men shouting, the smell of smoke and diesel and blood. He looked at the ditch, looked at the still not filled, still not crossable. He looked at the dozer. Dead. Finished. He looked at the tanks waiting behind him, and he made a decision. He walked around to the back of the dozer, opened the tool compartment, pulled out a shovel. If the machine couldn't finish the job, he'd finish it by hand. A tank commander, watching from his turret, shouted down, "What the hell are you doing?" Shoemaker didn't answer. He climbed down into the ditch, started shoveling dirt, packing it, leveling it. The tank commander stared. Then he climbed out of his tank, grabbed a shovel from his own equipment rack, climbed down into the ditch beside Shoemaker. "You're fucking crazy," the tanker said. But he was shoveling. Another soldier appeared, then another. Engineers, infantry, tankers, all of them grabbing shovels, entrenching tools, helmets, anything that could move dirt. Within 2 minutes, 15 men were in the ditch, shoveling, packing, leveling. German fire poured down. Mortar rounds landed close. Machine gun fire kicked up dirt. One soldier got hit, dropped his shovel, clutched his leg, was dragged out by 2 others. But the rest kept working, because Shoemaker had shown them something. If the machine stops, you keep going. If the tools break, you use your hands. If the job needs doing, you do it. No matter what. 10 minutes later, the ditch was filled, packed solid, level, wide enough for a tank. Shoemaker climbed out, waved the first Sherman forward. The tank rolled up, paused at the edge. Then, treads biting into the packed earth, it crossed, made it to the other side, kept moving. The next tank followed, then the next. Armor was rolling inland. The exits were fully open. Shoemaker stood beside the ditch, leaning on the shovel. His arms felt like lead. His back screamed. Every breath hurt. But the tanks were moving. The infantry was advancing. The supplies were flowing. The beach, the killing ground that had almost destroyed the entire invasion, was finally functioning as a beachhead. And somewhere in that success was the math he'd been avoiding all morning. 1 bulldozer, 1 man, 4 hours. In exchange, 2 exits opened. Hundreds of vehicles inland. Thousands of men off the beach. The price? He didn't know yet. His own survival felt temporary. borrowed, like something that could be called back at any moment. But for now, he was still breathing. And the road was clear. By 1100 hours, Omaha Beach had changed. Not in appearance. The wrecks were still there. The bodies still lined the shingle. The smoke still rose from burning vehicles. The German guns still fired from the bluffs. But the physics of the battle had shifted. Where before there had been chaos, men pinned, vehicles trapped, the assault grinding to a halt, now there was movement. Trucks rolled inland on the roads Shoemaker had cleared. Half-tracks carried infantry up the bluffs. Jeeps ferried ammunition to forward positions. Ambulances moved in both directions, empty going up, full coming back down. And most critically, armor. Sherman tanks climbed off the beach, traversed the exits, and pushed toward the German strongpoints. Artillery pieces, 105mm howitzers towed behind trucks, took up positions on the high ground and began counter-battery fire against the German guns. The balance of firepower was reversing. From the German perspective, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. For the first few hours, Omaha had been a victory. American forces trapped on the beach, casualties mounting, no breakthrough, the invasion stalling before it even began. But once the exits opened, everything changed. American armor could maneuver, infantry could advance with support, artillery could suppress the German positions that had been untouchable from the beach. The fortress that had seemed impregnable at dawn was now vulnerable, and it had all hinged on two narrow roads through the shingle. Roads that one bulldozer had carved, one man had kept open. The arithmetic was brutal, precise, undeniable. One bulldozer, unarmored, unarmed, worth maybe $5,000 in civilian equipment versus tens of thousands of German rounds, artillery shells at $50 each, mortar rounds, machine gun ammunition, hundreds of thousands of dollars in ordnance, all directed at one target. The Germans had committed massive resources to destroying that single piece of equipment, and failed. The result? Exit E1 and exit E3, open for vehicle traffic by 1,000 hours. First armor inland by 10:15 hours. First artillery in position by 10:45 hours. By 1100 hours, an estimated 1,500 vehicles off the beach. Infantry battalions reorganizing inland. German defensive positions under sustained American fire for the first time. The cost on the American side for opening those exits. One bulldozer operator, wounded but alive. One bulldozer, destroyed but mission complete. 15 soldiers assisting with the anti-tank ditch. 1 killed, 3 wounded. In the cold calculus of war, it was an impossibly favorable exchange. One man's refusal to stop working had multiplied into a force of thousands. Private First Class Eddie Conlon, 16th Infantry Regiment, had spent 3 hours pinned behind the shingle at exit E1. He'd hit the beach in the first wave, watched men die in the surf, crawled through sand while machine gun fire cut down anyone who stood. Made it to the shingle and stayed there, head down, rifle buried in the stones, convinced he'd die if he moved. Around him, men were getting hit by mortar fire. Wounded soldiers screamed for medics. Officers tried to organize an advance but couldn't get anyone to move. The German fire was too heavy, too accurate. Conlon had been certain he was going to die on that beach. Then he heard the bulldozer. At first, he thought it was a tank. But when he looked up, he saw it. A yellow dozer. blade down, pushing through the shingle 20 yards away. Shells landing around it, machine gun fire hammering the blade. And it just kept working. Didn't retreat, didn't hide. Just carved a path through the stones like it was a job site back in the States. When the ramp was finished, an officer shouted, "Move! Now! Up the exit!" Conlon hesitated. The German guns were still firing. But then he looked at the bulldozer operator, just a regular guy, not even an officer, sitting in that cab with no protection. And he thought, if that guy can do his job under this, I can do mine. He got up, ran, used the ramp the dozer had built, made it over the shingle, up the exit road, past the bluffs. He survived Omaha Beach because one man with a bulldozer decided to keep working. Years later, Conlon would tell the story to his grandchildren. He'd say, "People talk about the heroes of D-Day. They talk about the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the paratroopers, the officers rallying their men. But I'll tell you who saved my life. A guy I never met, whose name I didn't know, who drove a bulldozer through hell so I could get off that beach. That's who I owe." By noon, the situation at Omaha had stabilized. The German defenders, under pressure from American armor and artillery, began pulling back from forward positions. Some strong points held. Others collapsed. The line shifted inland. American forces established a foothold, narrow, fragile, but real. By evening, engineers were bringing in more equipment, more bulldozers, graders, supply trucks. The exits that Shoemaker had opened were being widened, reinforced, turned into permanent supply routes. Within 24 hours, Omaha Beach would be unrecognizable, organized, functional, a logistics hub capable of supporting tens of thousands of troops. But in those first critical hours, when the invasion could have collapsed, when men were drowning in the surf and dying on the sand, the difference had been measured in bulldozer blade widths. 2 ramps through the shingle, 2 roadblocks cleared, 1 anti-tank ditch filled. Small things. Technical things. The kind of work that doesn't make it into history books. But without it, there would have been no breakthrough, no advance, no foothold, just a beach full of wrecks and bodies, and the wreckage of a failed invasion. Shoemaker sat on the ground beside the dead bulldozer, back against the treads, rifle across his lap. Someone had handed it to him, told him he might need it. He watched the tanks roll past, watched the trucks, watched the infantry moving in columns up the bluffs. They didn't look at him, didn't know who he was, didn't know what he'd done. And that was fine. He wasn't looking for recognition, wasn't looking for anything except a moment to sit, to breathe, to let the exhaustion settle into his bones. His hands had finally stopped shaking. He looked at them, covered in blood, dirt, hydraulic fluid, blistered, cut, but still functional. A medic appeared, young kid, looked at Shoemaker's arm, the shrapnel wound, still bleeding. "You need that looked at." Shoemaker shook his head. "There are guys worse off." The medic frowned. "You've been bleeding for 2 hours. Come on." Shoemaker let the medic bandage his arm. Didn't argue. He was too tired to argue. When the medic finished, Shoemaker asked, "How many?" The medic knew what he meant. "Dead? Don't know yet. A lot. Maybe 2,000–3,000 on this beach alone." Shoemaker nodded slowly. 2,000 or 3,000. And he'd saved, how many? 100, 500, 1,000? There was no way to know, no way to calculate it. You couldn't measure the value of a road, couldn't count the lives saved by opening an exit. All he knew was, he'd done the job. He'd kept the machine running as long as it could run. And when it died, He'd finished by hand. That was all he'd been trained to do. That was all anyone could ask. A colonel walked past, stopped, looked at Shoemaker, looked at the bulldozer. "You the one who cleared E1 and E3? Shoemaker nodded. The colonel stared at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You just saved this entire goddamn beachhead. You know that?" Shoemaker didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. The colonel nodded. "Get some rest, son. You've earned it." He walked away. Shoemaker sat there, watching the war move inland without him, and for the first time all day, he let himself think about home. The Distinguished Service Cross arrived 3 months later. Shoemaker was in Belgium when they told him. Company C had pushed inland with the advance, clearing roads, building bridges, removing obstacles as the Allies drove toward Germany. He'd been rotated off the line for a few days, sitting in a supply depot, cleaning equipment, when an officer found him. "Private Shoemaker, you've been awarded the DSC for actions on Omaha Beach, June 6th. Shoemaker looked up from the engine he was rebuilding. "Sir?" The officer read from the citation. "For extraordinary heroism in action on 6th June 1944, near Colleville-sur-Mer, France. Private Shoemaker, operating an unarmored bulldozer under intense enemy artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, cleared vehicle obstacles from the beach, opened routes through the shingle barrier at exits E1 and E3, removed roadblocks, and filled an anti-tank ditch, enabling the advance of armor and infantry off Omaha Beach." His actions, performed with complete disregard for personal safety, were instrumental in the success of the amphibious assault. The officer looked at him. "That's the second highest military decoration in the United States Army, just below the Medal of Honor." Shoemaker didn't know what to say. He thought about the citation, the words, "complete disregard for personal safety." That wasn't how it had felt. He hadn't disregarded safety. He'd just done the job, the way he'd been trained, the way he knew how. But he didn't correct the officer. He just nodded. "Thank you, sir." The officer shook his hand. "Your country thanks you, Private." Then he left. Shoemaker went back to rebuilding the engine. He wasn't the only one. Private Vinton W. Dove, the other bulldozer operator from Company C who'd worked Omaha that day, received the Distinguished Service Cross as well. They'd alternated shifts on the dozer. When one was exhausted, the other took over. When the machine broke down, they'd both worked to fix it. When the job required 2 men with shovels, they'd both climbed into the ditch. The citation didn't distinguish between them, didn't say who did which task, just acknowledged that 2 men, working 1 bulldozer, had kept the exits open. Years later, someone would ask Shoemaker, "Who did more, you or Dove?" Shoemaker's answer was immediate. "Doesn't matter. The job needed doing. We did it." That was the only way he knew how to think about it. Not as heroism, not as competition, just as work. When the war ended, Shoemaker went home. Back to Ebensburg, Pennsylvania. Back to the mountains and the small-town streets he'd left 4 years earlier. He didn't talk much about the war, didn't tell stories at the local bar, didn't wear his medals on his jacket. When people asked, and they did at first, he'd give short answers. "I was in France, drove a bulldozer, came home." If they pressed for details, he'd change the subject. Not because he was modest, not because he thought his service was unimportant, but because the memories weren't simple, weren't clean, and trying to explain them to people who hadn't been there felt impossible. How do you explain what it felt like to sit in a bulldozer cab while the world exploded around you? How do you describe the sound of bullets hitting metal 6 inches from your head? The smell of burning vehicles and bodies in the surf? The weight of knowing that if you stopped, if you hesitated for even a moment, men would die because of it? You couldn't. So Shoemaker didn't try. He went back to construction work, drove bulldozers again, graded roads, cleared lots, moved dirt for shopping centers and housing developments in the post-war boom. It was the same work he'd done before the war, the same work he'd done during it, just without the bullets. His hands knew the controls, his body understood the rhythm. Throttle, blade, traction. The fundamentals didn't change, and there was something comforting in that. Something stable. The world had been chaos for 4 years. War, death, destruction, uncertainty. But a bulldozer was still a bulldozer. Dirt was still dirt. The job was still the job. That was something he could hold on to. He married, had children, worked steady jobs, paid his bills, lived quietly. His kids knew he'd been in the war, knew he'd been at D-Day, but they didn't know the details. He didn't tell them. Once, his daughter asked, "Dad, were you scared during the war?" Shoemaker thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I was scared." "But you did it anyway?" "Had to. It was the job." She was too young to understand what he meant. But when she got older, when she faced her own moments of fear, her own impossible tasks, she'd remember that answer. Had to. It was the job. There were nights when Shoemaker couldn't sleep. Not many. Not enough that his wife worried, but enough that he noticed. He'd lie in bed, listening to the quiet of small-town Pennsylvania, crickets, distant cars, the wind in the trees, and his mind would go back to Omaha Beach. Not to the bulldozer, not to the exits or the roadblocks or the ramps through the shingle, to the bodies, the ones under the ponchos, the engineers from Company C who didn't make it off the landing craft. The infantry he'd watched get hit by mortar fire while using the roads he'd cleared. He'd done his job. Done it well. Saved lives. But he hadn't saved everyone, and there was no logic to who lived and who died. No reason. Just luck. Or physics. Or God's will, if you believed in that. Shoemaker didn't know what he believed. He just knew that he'd been one of the ones who made it home, and others hadn't, and there was no making sense of that, so he didn't try. He just lay there in the dark, grateful and guilty in equal measure, until sleep finally came. In the decades that followed, D-Day became legend. Books were written, documentaries were made, memorials were built. Omaha Beach became a symbol, the bloodiest battle, the longest day, the turning point of the war. People talked about the Rangers who scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, the paratroopers who dropped behind enemy lines, the officers who rallied their men under fire. They didn't talk much about bulldozer operators, didn't talk about the engineers who cleared the obstacles, the men who operated the landing craft, the medics who worked under fire, the unglamorous jobs, the technical jobs, the ones that didn't involve rifles and grenades and dramatic last stands. And Shoemaker was fine with that. He'd never wanted to be famous, never wanted parades or speeches or his name in history books. He'd just wanted to do the job and go home, and he had. William J. Shoemaker lived a long life, raised his family, watched his children grow, saw his grandchildren born, worked until his body couldn't work anymore, then retired, sat on his porch, read the paper, watched the world change. When he died, years after the war, peacefully surrounded by family, The obituary in the local paper was short. It mentioned his service, mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross, mentioned D-Day, but it didn't explain what he'd done, didn't describe the bulldozer, didn't count the vehicles or the lives or the hours under fire, just said he served his country with distinction. And that was enough, because to Shoemaker, that's all it had ever been. Service, duty, work that needed doing, not heroism, just a man, doing his job, under circumstances that happened to be extraordinary. Today, if you visit Normandy, you can walk the beaches. The obstacles are gone. The wrecks have been cleared. The shingle has been worn smooth by decades of tide. Exits E1 and E3 are still there, paved now, marked with signs. Tourists drive up them in rental cars, heading to the American cemetery to pay their respects. Most don't know the exits were ever blocked, don't know that men died trying to open them, don't know that a bulldozer, unarmored, unarmed, operated by a 24-year-old private from Pennsylvania, worked for 4 hours under sustained fire to carve those roads into existence. There's no monument to that bulldozer, no plaque, no marker, just the road itself. And maybe that's fitting, because Shoemaker never wanted recognition. He just wanted the road to be clear, so the men behind him could keep moving. They called it a suicide mission. That morning, in the briefing room of a transport ship off the coast of Normandy, every man who looked at the map understood the math. A bulldozer, unarmored, moving at walking speed, operating in full view of German guns, had virtually no chance of survival on Omaha Beach. The officers knew it. The engineers knew it. The infantry waiting to use those exits knew it. One man with a bulldozer trying to clear obstacles under concentrated fire from artillery, mortars, and machine guns emplaced on the high ground? On paper, it was suicide. The odds said he'd be dead within the first 30 minutes. The logic said the mission was impossible. Every tactical assessment concluded the same thing. Whoever drove that bulldozer wasn't coming back. But Private William J. Shoemaker didn't see it that way. He saw a job, a difficult job, a dangerous job, the kind where mistakes cost lives and hesitation meant failure. But still, fundamentally, just a job. And he knew how to do the job. Throttle control, blade angle, weight distribution, traction, engine response. The same principles he'd drilled 1,000 times in training, the same techniques he'd used on construction sites back in Pennsylvania. The only difference was the noise and the consequences. So when the ramp dropped and the bullets started flying, Shoemaker treated them the way he'd been trained to treat distractions. He tuned them out, focused on the work, on the controls, on the machine. Push, reverse, reposition, clear. One obstacle at a time, one task at a time, methodically, professionally, like it was a training exercise. Except the bullets were real, and the stakes were the entire invasion. He treated 20,000 German bullets like background noise, and by doing that, by refusing to let the chaos break his focus, by sticking to his training, by simply doing the work he'd been taught to do, he turned a suicide mission into a legend. The history books remember D-Day for the infantry assaults, the ranger companies scaling cliffs, the paratroopers dropping into darkness, the officers rallying their men under fire. Those stories deserve to be told. Those men deserve to be honored. But wars aren't won by heroic charges alone. They're won by logistics, by engineers, by the men who build the roads and clear the obstacles and keep the supply lines open, by the unglamorous jobs, the technical jobs, The ones that don't make good movie scenes. The jobs where success looks like a road that's passable, a ditch that's filled, a ramp through a pile of stones. Small things. But without them, nothing else works. On Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, the difference between victory and catastrophe came down to 2 narrow roads through a shingle barrier. If those exits stayed closed, vehicles couldn't move inland, armor couldn't advance, infantry couldn't get support. The entire assault would have stalled on the beach, pinned down, taking casualties, until the tide came in or the Germans counterattacked. The invasion could have failed, right there, in the first 6 hours. But it didn't fail, because one man, a 24-year-old private, a construction worker from Pennsylvania, someone whose name most people have never heard, sat in a bulldozer cab for 4 hours and did his job. Under artillery fire, under mortar fire, under sustained machine gun fire from multiple directions. While German gunners threw everything they had at him, trying to stop the one piece of equipment that could break their defensive line. And he didn't stop, didn't panic, didn't retreat, didn't freeze. He just kept working. Because that's what the job required. There's a paradox at the heart of this story. The men who called it a suicide mission weren't wrong. By every reasonable measure, Shoemaker should have died on that beach. The odds were overwhelming. The firepower directed at him was immense. Survival was, statistically, nearly impossible. But Shoemaker survived. Not because he was lucky, not because the Germans were bad shots, not because of divine intervention. He survived because he treated the mission differently than everyone else. Where others saw an impossible task, a death sentence, Shoemaker saw a series of technical problems that he knew how to solve. Where others would have been paralyzed by fear, Shoemaker was focused on hydraulic pressure and blade angles. Where others would have counted the bullets and calculated their odds, Shoemaker was thinking, next obstacle. Clear it. Move on. The mission didn't change. The danger didn't change. The bullets didn't stop. But the mindset, the refusal to see the task as anything other than work that needed doing, made all the difference. Heroism isn't always what we think it is. It's not always dramatic, not always loud, not always the stuff of medals and monuments. Sometimes heroism is just this, a man who knows his job, who's trained for his job, and who, when the moment comes, when the world is on fire and everyone around him is convinced he's going to die, simply does his job. No speeches, no grand gestures, no cinematic moments, just steady hands on the controls, one task after another, until the work is done. William J. Shoemaker didn't set out to be a hero that morning. He set out to clear some obstacles, open some roads, keep the vehicles moving. He did what he'd been trained to do, what he knew how to do, what needed to be done. And in doing that, in treating an impossible mission like a difficult day's work, he helped save thousands of lives and turned the tide of the most important battle of World War II. They called it a suicide mission. He called it Tuesday. And that difference, that quiet, unshakable professionalism in the face of overwhelming odds, is what turned a man with a bulldozer into a legend that almost no one knows, but should. If you visit Normandy today, you can stand on Omaha Beach and look up at the bluffs where the German guns once sat. You can walk the sand where thousands of men landed, where hundreds died in the first minutes. You can drive up exit E1 or exit E3. The roads are paved now. Clean. Easy. And you'll probably never think about the fact that those roads, the ones you're driving on, the ones that feel so permanent and obvious, didn't exist on the morning of June 6, 1944. They had to be built, under fire, by a man in a bulldozer who everyone said was going to die. But didn't, because he knew how to do his job. And he did it. While 20,000 German bullets tried to stop him, the story of D-Day is full of names we remember: Eisenhower, Bradley, the 29th Infantry Division, the Rangers, but it's also full of names we don't: the engineers, the bulldozer operators, the men who built the roads under fire so others could advance. If stories like this, about the people who changed history not with rifles, but with wrenches and shovels, and the stubborn refusal to quit, are the kind of stories you want to hear more of, let me know in the comments. Subscribe. Share this with someone who appreciates the quiet heroes, because the world needs to remember, sometimes the most important weapon on the battlefield isn't a gun. It's a man who knows his job, and does it no matter what.